Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Hal Bradley. I would like to ask us, each and every one of you, that if you enjoyed these shows, please hit like, share, and subscribe after you view the show. Thank you very much.
Well, hello, world. Welcome to another episode of the Crisis Victory Show. My name is Dr. Hal Bradley. I'm the host. My co-host, Pete Turner, is floating there in the background somewhere. Pete, pop in and say hi to the world.
Hi,
There
world.
he is. Hi, buddy. Okay. Today, we have a very unique guest. His name is Ken Orrock. Ken Orrock and I have, at one time in our lives, we're both on opposite sides of the fence, where he was involved in law enforcement. I was an international smuggler for the Sinaloa drug cartel. And Pete, or Ken, today I'm going to be kind of curious as to line some of the years up in our conversation, because as you know, I did transfer over to the other side, your side, and spent 17 years as an undercover operative for the Department of Justice, operating under multiple agencies in multiple foreign countries. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you at this time, Pete, to my audience, or Ken, excuse me. And Ken, nothing but respect for you, sir. And thank you for coming on my show today.
Appreciate it. Same back at you. It's good to hear stories. You know, we all travel different paths in life, and hopefully we all end up in the same place in the end, because that's the goal.
Amen.
But how we get there is unique to each of us, and it influences and shapes how we view the world. And definitely looking forward to this conversation.
You know, me too, buddy. This is really going to be great today. So first question I have for you. When did you first become actively involved in law enforcement? Was it after military service? Was it during military service?
No, I did things a little backwards. I grew up on the beach in Southern California, and I had a long desire to go into law enforcement, and I was sort of in a hurry to do it. And going into law enforcement, actually, for me at a very young age, as I'll tell you, was somewhat of an act of childhood rebellion.
Interesting.
My father and my father's family were attorneys, and my mom's family were cops. And my teenage rebellion against my father was, instead of following that traditional path and going on to college right away, and that is, I decided I was going to go into law enforcement. And so I spent some time doing some research when I was still in high school and others. And at that time, in California, you could actually become a law enforcement officer at age 18. Most of the departments required 21, especially the larger departments.
Of course.
But there were still, several dozen sheriff's departments that hired at age 18. So after I graduated from high school in the mid 80s, I'd gone to the library, and this is dating myself a little bit, going to the library, not getting online and looking stuff. And I found out that the California Commission on Police Officer Standards and Training published an annual report. And that annual report included every law enforcement agency in the state, and also had their hiring requirements. And so I found a half a dozen or so sheriff's office, because my grandfather had been a Los Angeles sheriff's deputy. I had a desire to work for a sheriff's department because I felt that was more in line with what I wanted to do. And so I ended up applying. And in the second half of my 18th year of life, and I actually went around the state. My mom actually traveled with me to some places, and interviewed for those. And so actually 4 days after my 19th birthday, I was sworn in as a deputy sheriff for Imperial County, California.
Wow. That's amazing. What year was that?
1987.
God, 87. Yeah, I think I was in Folsom Prison that particular year, but a couple of years before that, I was running loads out of Mexico. So this is going to be fun today. It really is. When did you become involved in border activity? I understand from Pete telling me that you did have some experience relative to working with some of the borders. And
I did. And for the listeners that don't know, Imperial County, California sits in that bottom southeast corner of California. So it borders Mexico. The biggest town it borders would be Mexicali, Mexico.
Yeah,
then it borders Arizona, to the east, Riverside County to the north, and San Diego County to the west. So
That was an active area.
it was an active
Yeah.
area. I started noticing even when I went on my first ride along before my oral interview boards, it was with the South County Patrol and the proximity to the border. At that time it was a little different still than it became. But certainly was that border activity. When I first came out of the academy, I did work in the jail before I got any patrol experience. And so some of my first knowledge of the border and the border conflict and immigration issues and all that was working in the Imperial County Jail in El Centro, California, which was the only jail in the county. We also housed higher risk federal prisoners for the Border Patrol and other federal agencies. So that was that first experience, and what an eye-opening awakening for a pretty naive kid in hindsight that grew up on the beach surfing and in the waves, and now I'm in the desert on the border with a star on my chest.
Yeah, the Orellana Felix organization based in Tijuana controlled part of that corridor, as did the Sinaloa drug cartel. So you were right there on the line between two mega cartels at that time. They were pretty active by the mid 1980s, as I remember. My first, I took a winter break in 1974, and my first crossing was in the early part of 1975, and I spent 6 years running that border, but mainly Highway 15 up to Highway 2, and I was going through Nogales, did a couple through Juarez over there, but I did Mexico, Mexicali, Calexico. I definitely did Tijuana multiple times, and actually had a really good friend of mine who would be up on that bridge above it that we would drive under as we're clearing in, and he'd be waving at me, and identifying that I was coming through. And as you know, later in my career, after the cocaine industry erupted and we were moved out of the marijuana movement and got into the cocaine thing, I ended up spending a number of years stateside as a high-level trafficker for the Sinaloa cartel. In our former conversations, you knew that I knew El Chapo and Rafael Cara Quintero and Miguel Angel Gallardo Felix. And I mean, I knew them all. I met
some bad dudes.
Yeah, they were. And I knew Ramon Arellano Felix when he was 7 years old. I met him down there. Yeah, he came down with I believe it was an uncle. I was living in a mining camp down in Durango, Mexico on the Zacatecas border in 1969 and 1970. I had been kicked out of school, and my mom didn't want me wandering the streets, and she had a friend that owned a mining organization down there, so they sent me down there, and that's how I ended up in that environment.
Sure.
And I remember my only transportation was a burro. I was up in the mountains, and I would ride my burro in the canyons down to Walterio, the little town below me. And my bodyguard, I had a private bodyguard, a guy named Memo, who was a ruthless, dangerous man. And his whole responsibility was to keep this little Juanito alive until they got me back to the United States. But I remember one time where a friend of his came in from Tijuana, and he brought this 7-year-old kid with him, and the kid would go riding, and his name was Ramon Arellano Felix. And then many years later in my life, I was down in Tijuana, and I connected with somebody that knew Ramon and Benjamin, of course, the family. And so Ramon and I got together, and it was just amazing. We spent 3 days of banging hookers, snorting coke, and just going totally insane. And I never saw him after that, but I did get a call when he was shot and killed in Mazatlan. And I just, I really did feel a certain type of a loss for as insane and as crazy as Ramon Arellano Felix was. He was a very, very loose cannon in that industry, but hey, at that time, they were moving anywhere from 15 to 20 metric tons of cocaine a month into the United States. Yeah. That was your time, Ken. I go all the way back when I've got photographs of me with Chapo 43 years ago when we were just weed guys, and
right.
I would drive. Go ahead, please.
I was going to say, I mean, first of all, understandable to felt the loss. You're a human being. He was a human being, and you had a connection at some level, but I don't think that people now, when they see, especially what they've seen in the last 5 to 10 years on the border, understand how much the border changed from
Oh.
where it was. When I was working the border regions, it was pretty open. Of course, Border Patrol was present. The Sheriff's Department and other agencies did work the border, but nothing like it is today. And people, especially when you live in a high density border community, people are going back and forth across the border all day, every day, all the time.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
You know, there were, and we were safe crossing the border. You know, I think back, something that you would never see happen today is we'd get off a graveyard shift and a group of us would meet down in Calexico, and we'd park our vehicles in the Border Patrol parking lot. We'd take off our uniform shirts and our gun belts and our Kevlar vests and throw them in the trunks of our car. And then you'd have this group of guys wearing black boots and green pants and white T-shirts. And
Yeah.
you'd walk across the border and have breakfast.
Why not?
Why not?
That's your neighbor.
And the 10-cent tacos and
Yeah.
25-cent Coca-Colas or 50-cent long neck beers. And it was an enjoyable place to unwind. And coming off graveyard shift, you'd get somebody first thing in the morning and they'd be patting out the tortillas and throwing them on. And
nothing better.
Nothing better at all. And so those types of things were not uncommon back then, and something you would never see today. And towards the later part of the 80s, 88, 89, that all started to change. If we'd be on patrol and we'd encounter somebody in those early days that was an illegal alien, and we'd find them walking on a gravel road in northern Imperial County, maybe up towards the Salton Sea or something, we could look at them and tell them, hey, take a seat or sit in the back of my car, and it would be yes, sir, and they would do it. And
Sure.
And we would call the Border Patrol, and they would come get them. And we didn't see, I can't recall in my time seeing any violence from, your economic migrant population back there and the people that were coming across, seeking a better life and those types of things. I mean, they were committing crimes. We were going to enforce the law and do our thing, but there wasn't a high threat level. And the Border Patrol was a lot different back then. They were,
oh my God, Gus.
Yeah.
We were actually given lanes to go through at shift changing times, and we knew people that were even on the American side on the payroll of the cartels that were operational there, and we would get flagged through. We had all that done for us. So, but it isn't that way anymore, and I want to make that absolutely clear, as you do too, I'm sure.
No,
my last run out of Mexico was in 1981, and as you know, I spent 17 years working with various agencies in the Department of Justice to pay back my sins. And I wasn't arrested, by the way. I walked in on my own free will in 1993.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah, I was moving a quarter to a third of a ton of cocaine at a time by then. And went to Culiacan to get out of this life forever. I grew up with them, for Christ's sakes. I knew some of those guys from my 15, 16 year of age childhood years. And everybody was hugs and handshakes. And I came back to the United States and I had 350 kilos of cocaine sitting in my driveway, which was their answer. So the following day, I turned the load around. Following day, walked into the U.S. Attorney's office and they just flipped out. They couldn't believe Hal Bradley had just walked in. But you know what? There was a right and wrong to all of it. When we were back in the marijuana of the years, like you just said, how they were nonviolent people. But I'll tell you something, 1979, 1980, when cocaine came into the cartels there through the Mexican corridors from South America, it went insane, extremely violent. The massive amount of money that we were dealing with, I mean, you couldn't even hide box loads of it in the vehicles. We could put money from marijuana deals in.
Yeah, it was less of a problem to get the product into the United States than it was to get the money out and what to do with it once you got
Damn right it was. Everything changed overnight in that world, and that was the deciding factor. And as a child, I was a Cub Scout. I was a Boy Scout. 2 weeks after I was 17, I was in the United States Army, served my country, honorably discharged out in 1974. And like I said, by 75, I went down simply to visit my village, to say hi, because I loved Mexico. I loved the people and how they had treated me and conditioned me, but they had also groomed me. And unbeknown to me being groomed, the real shock wave came in after my military service and I went down there. And I think it's interesting to note, and I think the audience from both of our standpoints should note the relevance and the importance of the beauty of that country and those people. Like when you were talking about going across to have breakfast in the morning with your compadres and your friends, when it's a whole different world. Once you cross that border, you're into a whole different environment, and it's wonderful and it's welcoming. And like you said, hand pounding the tacos and tortillas, and there's nothing better. There's
No,
nothing better.
no.
And
And one funny thing I tell people often too is, to this day, some of the best Chinese food I've ever had was in Mexicali, Mexico, because people don't realize in Baja there's traditionally been a large Chinese population. And I can remember sitting in an old warehouse style restaurant with just picnic benches under a tin roof and having some of the best Chinese food I'd ever had too. But yeah, it
that's
changed.
interesting.
It changed. People changed. The economics changed, and what I think really changed it, and it's symbolic of playing whack-a-mole and putting pressure one place, which moves the pressure to someplace else. Was in the mid to late 80s. We're talking the Miami Vice era and the southern Florida drug channels and lanes. Suddenly we're having so much enforcement and pressure on it that by nature the industry looked for where is less resistance than we're getting now.
Absolutely. That's true.
Yeah, in that Miami corridor. And where do we have less resistance? Well, we have less resistance in coming up either through the deserts of Baja or the deserts of the other Mexican states that run along the border. The Gulf
basically
states.
3,000 miles of uncharted border back in those years.
Yeah,
there was
absolutely.
All the way to Texas. It was all wide open. It was unbelievable. It was an unbelievable time. And a lot of the federal agents I worked with over the years, especially customs agents, had a lot of, and they would sit there and they would literally interrogate me in a friendship way. Because, when I was smuggling down there, we had Mexican state police pulling up in their cars, opening up their trunks and offloading the stuff that was being hidden in the compartments of my car and the cars of the guys I recruited to work for me, bringing marijuana up. So we had law enforcement totally involved and encompassed in our business. We also had American law enforcement agents working in customs at that time on the border that were on the payroll of the cartels. I mean, we had it all going. That doesn't exist anymore. I don't believe for an instant, based on what is it? It's a three-way confirmation now that they do in law enforcement. There's at least 3 people that are in the circle of every single man on that border that are law enforcement affiliated. So you can't be bought and paid for because you're so cross-checked.
Well, I think that, I'd never think, and this comes a little bit of my counterintelligence background too, is human frailty it still exists. And
I'm not saying it's perfect.
Yeah, it was human frailty that allowed those people to be corrupted or to be subjected to some type of blackmail or some type of
Plata or Plumo. It was
Yeah.
Plata or Plumo, and you know that working the border. Silver or lead,
Absolutely.
that was your choice.
Absolutely. So, I think it's much more sophisticated in the corruption that occurs now. I don't think it doesn't exist. I don't think we'll ever get it to not exist because we're flawed, sinful human beings. But yeah, they've come up with some better checks and balances. Back in those days, which is another change that probably people don't realize, when you drove across the border, you had 2 potential law enforcement agencies that would get you at that booth. You could end up speaking to a customs inspector, or you could end up speaking to an immigration inspector.
Yes.
And back then, one wore a blue shirt and one wore a white shirt. And so even though they were working in parallel, you had 2 different agencies that were, actually participating in that. And the 9/11 and the formation of Homeland Security and the devolving. Devolving of the Department of Justice versus the Department of Treasury agency. So, you had immigration guys that were Department of Justice, and you had customs guys that were Department of Treasury. So that changed, and it did. But back to the point of the corruptibility, I think that these international criminal organizations have much more of a footprint in the United States now and are able to apply pressure differently in the home communities of these law enforcement officers than they were back in those days. So some of the big changes, but yeah, when it started coming across the border and it was no longer, coming in by sea or by air into South Florida, into the Bahamas, into Louisiana and those kinds of places, our world changed. It really did. I can remember an incident down there where, patrol deputy observed what he thought was an aircraft crashing. And as he radioed for, to find out if the control tower was reporting anything, he saw it land on a gravel road and be met by some trucks, and they suddenly started offloading it and moving kilo bricks of cocaine into the back of a pickup truck, and this deputy's up there by himself, unable
Boy, that's
to
life and death. Jeez.
Yeah, smart enough not to get involved in it.
Very smart.
but we saw that. We started seeing, what we used to call a load vehicle back then would be a van loaded with 15, 16, 17 illegal aliens.
Yeah.
And that was a load vehicle. And then that load vehicle suddenly changed to now a load vehicle we're calling a vehicle that it would have illegal drugs in it. We used to be able to drive along the border and in relative safety. And that changed. We started taking rounds from the Mexican side, and people would be shooting. There's a famous incident down in Imperial County where, for those not familiar with the county, back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they irrigated this desert floor and created some of the best farmland in the country with irrigation canals running off the Colorado River. And so we had these rather large canals moving a lot of water that basically, 364 prime growing days a year for agriculture down there.
Yeah.
But there'd be a van that went into that canal, and the dive team was called out, and you said, dive team in the desert, that's sort of strange. But we had a dive team because there were these canals, and there was the Salton Sea up in the northern part of the county, and the dive team, thought they were recovering a vehicle that had crashed into the canal and didn't know if there were bodies inside or anybody that needed to be rescued. And when they hooked up to that with the tow truck and started pulling on it, they started taking rounds from the border, pinning them down. And in the end, the deputies were able to get some help because these guys are all wearing shorts and T-shirts and doing dive stuff, not doing law enforcement stuff.
That story is familiar to me. I don't know where I've heard that, but as you're describing it, I remember this.
Yeah. And when they did finally get the van out, it was stuffed full of kilos of cocaine. So, I mean, the mindset changed among law enforcement because to a certain extent, it had been a gentleman's game. We're not going to hurt you if it's not called for. You're not going to do anything to harm us if it's not called for. If we lose the product, that's built into our business plan. We don't want to lose it, but we're not going to risk a larger incident or risk injury, death, or more heat coming down on us by going after people recovering those loads. And so, those are the fundamental changes. And, one of the funniest stories that showed the law enforcement attitude and change during that time period was we were actually issued lever action 30-30 rifles as our rifle on desert. Old people
Shot a lot of deer with those.
Yeah,
good rifle, short
people
range.
that don't know, I'm talking cowboy guns with the lever you rack on the bottom, and we started taking so many rounds and getting shot at so often that the Deputy Sheriff's Association went to the sheriff and said, we'd like to go to an AR-15 type rifle or some other semi-automatic rifle to protect ourselves. And back then we had a very old school sheriff down there on the border. His name was Orrock Fox, and Sheriff Fox was a legend down there. He was a very large, gregarious man. He called us all his lads. The normal welcome from him would be, "Good morning, lad. How you doing today, lad?"
Old school.
Yeah. And so the Sheriff's Association, our union, went to the sheriff and said, we'd like to go to these rifles. We feel that the threat level has gotten so high that we need a better way to protect ourselves. And the sheriff, in his old school manner, said, I think either of those rifles you're suggesting would be too offensive looking to the public if you pulled it out.
Interesting.
And my good friend to this day, who was my training officer down there and is one of my best friends who taught me things that are the reason I'm alive today as my training officer. And there's not a lot of people you can say touched you in your life, but my good friend Rick Williams, who retired as the chief deputy coroner down there, looked up at the sheriff and said, Sheriff, if we have to pull out that rifle, we want the public to be so offended that they stop shooting at us.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I got a quote. Go ahead,
Sure.
please.
No, please.
I have a question for you. There is also the reverse smuggling that was going on, and that you were, during the years you're describing, would be very involved and very understanding of this. What about the purchasing of firearms and weapons in the United States at the gun shows that were being smuggled back into Mexico? When did you guys first become alerted to the severity of that problem?
It wasn't until much later.
Yeah,
because
it
at
was.
that time, the Mexican customs officials, the likelihood of you being checked going into Mexico was incredibly low.
0 to none. It just about.
I had it happen on only one occasion that I can remember, and had a good friend. It was a deputy by the name of Miguel Rodriguez. Miguel had been born in Mexicali and had come to the U.S. side when he was in his teens. He was an absolute kung fu master. He had several dojos in Mexicali and in California, and he was very, very highly respected on both sides of the border. And he invited me once to go down with him, and he was going to drop off things he had bought at, wouldn't have been Walmart back then, but things he'd gone shopping for his mom, who lived in Mexicali. Yeah. And he'd loaded up his trunk, and he said, why don't you go down with me? We'll drop this to my mom, and we'll get some lunch while we're down there. And I said, this is outstanding. This is great. And so we get down, and we actually get stopped crossing into Mexico back then. And they had the very traditional high peak brim caps and everything that you think of a South American dictator wearing in their uniforms. And he started searching through the car and found all these things that Miguel was taking down to his mom. And basically he was trying to elicit a bribe from Miguel to bring this stuff into the country. And Miguel kept saying to him, excuse me a second, please call your supervisor, get your supervisor out here. And Miguel knew something I didn't know. The supervisor, El Capitan at the border there, was one of Miguel's students. And he came out and saw it was Miguel and saw it was this guy and just laid into the Mexican official. You will not stop Senor Rodriguez when he comes across the border. You will not this, you will not that. And we continued on. So I guess the sort of attitude you can glean from that is we were only doing it, or they, as the Mexican customs officials, were only inspecting southbound vehicles at that time to elicit bribes or to, exert some kind of influence. It was not to stop smuggling into Mexico.
Into Mexico, right. The reason I brought that up, Ken, is because I was actually involved in some of the gun purchasing. What they would do is they would use me as a güerito, a white boy from the village, to go to the gun shows and actually convert some of the money that we were, getting from our sales of narcotics and convert them into weapons. And then I would take these weapons and I would meet with Mexican nationals, and then they would take it from there and cross them into Mexico. So I was around that for a couple of years, actually, probably 82, 83, maybe 84 before I got in trouble. But yeah, that and we were buying lots of weapons at these gun shows.
But you
I would literally.
You didn't need to go through the ports back then to do that stuff.
No, you did not.
You could, if there was a fence across the desert, it was maybe a 3-wire or some posts in the ground, and that was it. And if you had a 4-wheel drive vehicle, you could easily.
You were good to go.
That. Yeah. You had the main ports of entry in Calexico and those areas, but there were old abandoned ports of entry that had good roads to them too along there that had been ports in previous decades. So that kind of stuff was definitely different. And again, in the 80s, and at least with the sheriff's department, we didn't see a whole lot of that.
No.
We did on occasion. But, the border region, and more so, and you'd have an understanding in the Tijuana sector
Yes.
back in those days, but even in ours, there was a certain level of no man's land on both sides of the border. And, for people interested in what was going on in the border in those days, Joseph Wambaugh's Lines and Shadows is an incredible book about.
I've heard of that book. I haven't
Yeah.
read it yet, but I have heard of it.
Well, it was Sandy. It's a true story. It's not fictionalized, and I actually know a couple of the cast of characters that are in it. It was the San Diego Police Department and the San Diego County Law Enforcement Agency's response to the illegal aliens being preyed on and victimized as they crossed the border.
Absolutely.
And this misconception in popular culture that local law enforcement, especially along the border, did not care about the well-being of those economic migrants is very.
That's not true.
It's just not true.
Yeah, there's a lot of compassion. There was a lot of humanity. I'm aware of that. And I'm glad you brought that up, Ken, because it wasn't all cold and ruthless. In the 1970s, we were cowboys, for God's sakes. It was like the wild, wild frickin' West for us that were in the criminal side of it. And, coming up Highway 15 and hitting Highway 2, and then you hit the 28-kilometer zone where you scratch your Turista sticker off your car showing that you were inland too far. Right. And then you get into the border towns and you get someone to wash your car, throw a few things in the back seat, and you were simply nothing more than a tourist for the day. Yeah. You already know your lane assignment that you're going through. You know the time to hit it when the shift change happens, and bang, you're right through like no problem at all. Brother, that does not exist anymore. No. It is not that way. And, we didn't have x-ray machines back in the 70s, brother. We didn't have none of that stuff. We didn't even
have a lot of dogs back then.
We didn't. But I do remember when dogs started showing up in Nogales. I do remember it. Yeah, like I said, 1981 was my last time crossing through, and I was moving cocaine by that time. And I had picked up a plane. I was a VFR certified flyer, and I was going through the, the Yaqui Reservation, half in the United States, half, And what we did was about 200 miles north of Hermosillo, we had a guy blade out an airstrip on his ranch, and we would come in there, drop in the airstrip, load planes, and come back through. Well, after I went to work for Customs and I'd been with the agencies for a few years, I had sensed when they said, Hal, you just missed it because now we have sensor devices and all those canyons, and none of that existed when we were playing that game.
No.
So that's what I told you, that there's no way in hell we would be successful to the degree that we were back in the day. I mean, I didn't even know anybody that got busted on the border. I didn't. We all were instructed how to be, I was taught when I first started doing those loads, brother, to spray deodorant on exposed skin, including my face, wear sunglasses that aren't too dark but not too light, drive a car that's not too old but not brand new. I mean, every description we were given was based on intelligence of their side of how to get it through without losing, which is more important than the drugs themselves, were the people that we were established that were doing the work. Now it's different. Hell, they throw all kinds of people into cars and let them drive across, and they don't care. Back then, it was just, it was just different back then. And I know we're getting close to the end of the interview, but I got to tell you, Ken, talking to you is just like going back in memory lane to me, brother. And I'm really glad that you came out of it okay. I can hear it in your voice that you yourself can still remember and still relate to the wonderful memories. And, we always respected law enforcement people. We never talked back to them or disrespected in any form or fashion. They had a job to do. We had a job to do. It was simple as that. And that's how we were taught until the cocaine came into play. Then it went from, if you had a problem with the guy, you put a bullet in his head and you left his body where it dropped. Boy, it changed after the cocaine came in. Then it was all about torture and going after people's family relatives and slowly killing them in front of their family. And I have seen unimaginable things, Ken, unimaginable, years of it. Yeah. And looking back at the change and the transition. But I was in the game before you came into the game. So what you have seen and what you've experienced is that second elevation, if you will, of the exact time of the transitioning of the international trafficking. And when you were talking about there were certain areas where it was dangerous for people to go through, yeah, if the narcotraficantes control the region, you couldn't run wetbacks through that region. Excuse me for saying that term, but that's what we called.
That's what the term was in the day.
Yeah, I disrespect no human race, but the point is this: there were areas where it was literally lethal to cross human trafficked people into those areas, and those areas were marked by the cartels, and they were enforced by the cartels. And the reason they did that was for security purposes. They needed less eyes on activity in certain passage points where some of the tunnels were at, things to this nature. So it evolved. It evolved, and it evolved dramatically once the money evolved dramatically.
It did. And law enforcement, you know, and the same goes through in my other life in counterintelligence, as our friend Pete would know, is we're always, you know, a couple steps behind the threat that we're countering. And, you know, so we're reacting in a certain way, and that reactionary gap exists from the time things start happening, or like you said, the time the money starts flowing, and the time that it happens. And, you know, one of the things that did not happen back then, very limited, was things like having helicopters and air support in these open areas of the border. I can remember being up in the northern part of the county as a deputy and watching a plane land on a road, and it was a Border Patrol Piper Cub with two Border Patrol agents, and they were flying old 1950s, 60s vintage Piper Cubs. But then, you know, one of the most tragic things I ever encountered down there would have been in October of 1988. They started what they called back then called Operation Border Ranger. It's now that particular iteration is referred to as Border Ranger 1. And that was a joint effort between the California National Guard's aviation assets and the Southern California Sheriff's offices. And in that tragic incident in that October, we had a National Guard Huey helicopter with 3 National Guardsmen on board, 2 pilots and a crew chief, and 5 deputies. One of them was one of my sergeants representing the Imperial County Sheriff's Office, but there were San Diego, Riverside, and Los Angeles deputies on that helicopter also. And they dove on a suspected load vehicle coming across the border, and the pilot didn't see the high power lines. And oh
my God.
Yeah, the way he hit it, it sheared the rotor off. The helicopter inverted and landed, you know, straight down from a couple hundred feet onto its rooftop, and everybody on board was unfortunately killed. And that became the first person I ever knew, and actually I knew 2 of them. I knew the Riverside deputy also had been one of my instructors in the academy. The 2 of their names are on the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C. And that really started changing an attitude towards a lot of things. You know, it wasn't any direct action by cartel or smugglers that caused that. They didn't bring the helicopter under fire. They didn't do something to make it crash, but it was just that inherent danger of operating along the border where there's not a lot of lights, where you have mixed terrain and those kinds of things. So that program went on for years afterwards. And you know, several friends of mine, including Rick Williams, I spoke of earlier, became heavily involved as observers in that program. And that started to have a technology change. Fast forward to today, they've got more whiz bang equipment on these Customs and Border Patrol helicopters than the military does in a lot of ways, with their ability to see in the dark and see through bushes and terrain and find things. So, you know, back then they were flying the old helicopters like you see in MASH with a big double front to it and Piper Cubs. And then now today you've got top of the line military grade aviation assets. Being
thank God we do. Thank God we do.
It does.
Know, the technology of today, the border is so much more dangerous than it was during my years of being operational down there on both sides of the law. And I'll tell you something, your counterintelligence background, we may have to have another show another time, because I'm definitely going to want to hear about that. I love Pete. I love Pete's background. We've had an extensive relationship these last few years. And, you know, we've both spent so much time operating outside the wire in different foreign countries, gone through so much. And Now I find out that you're a counterintelligence, you have counterintelligence background. So yeah, I might want to call you back, Ken. We're wrapping up at this point though. And do you have a closing message for my audience? I always ask my guests to do that.
Yeah, I think my closing message to the audience and everybody that listens is, as we go through life, we should never define any individual by the worst thing they ever did or the biggest mistake they ever made. Everybody is deserving of redemption, and everybody is deserving of having a fresh start. And that doesn't always occur. And we've become very black and white in our society, and this zero defect mentality that people have towards people doing something wrong at some point in their life. And that's just not realistic. That's not what we as followers of Christ and otherwise are commanded to do. So don't define people by their worst moment in their life. You can learn something from everybody, even if what you learn is, I'm never going to do that.
Yes.
So, that would be my message. And for those that do come in contact with law enforcement and deal with law enforcement, this current culture that's existed for the last 5 or 6 years of demonization is really not fair.
It's horrible.
Most of the law enforcement officers I know, not all, but most of them are just good, hardworking people. Most of them are middle class people. A lot of them are veterans. And they're some of the few people in this world. They're not the only ones. My brothers and sisters in the fire service and other emergency services. There's very few people in this world that live up to the biblical statement that there is no greater love than to lay down one's life for a friend.
Yes.
And the majority of the people that are in law enforcement emergency services not only are willing to lay down their lives for a friend, but they're willing to lay down their lives for an absolute stranger. And
Ken, I gotta cut in there and share something with you, my brother. I told you before the show when I met you through Pete, I actually had an agent lay his body over my body because they were concerned about a sniper shot coming at me. And here's a guy that was a criminal, a massive criminal, and here's a law enforcement agent that shielded that former criminal with his own body. So, this is probably the best closing statement I have ever heard in almost 60 shows that I've done. And I want to say another thing to you and your family. Happy Thanksgiving. I want to wish you the very best, sir. I want to thank you and all law enforcement people for what you've done for this country. You deserve recognition. And I just think you're one hell of a guy, and you are my Christian brother. God bless you, my friend.
You too, my friend. I look forward to many more conversations and to learning from you.
And you, sir. Thank you very much. Okay, folks. Well, that wraps up another episode today. And I'd like to take this moment to thank each and every one of you for taking your time to catch our show. Now, if you like these shows, I would ask that you would please hit like, share, and subscribe. It's so important to us that we get these messages out, and we understand that these are graphic, almost toxic interviews. But, this is the kind of impact that we feel is needed in order to make sure that people understand the significance of the problems that we are confronted within our own country and around the globe. So I'm going to say at this time that I love you all. God bless you all. Hasta luego, y vaya con Dios, and go Victors.